In this video module, we'll look at creating a Python script for computing the sample mean of a set of numbers, and then how to execute that Python script from the command line. And so here's the script that, here we are, here's the script that we want over here on the left, starting here with numbers, and then a screenshot of the command prompt actually executing that script. And so for the purposes of this video, we're not here to look at the Python code. So in other words, we're not going to spend time interpreting what the Python code does and how it works and so on. That'll be later on. The purpose of this video module is to actually show how to create this script and then execute the script using, again, the command prompt. And so what we're going to do is following the 5 steps given here. First of all, we need to decide where we want to keep the code. So we're going to create a program, create a Python program, and we need to decide where we want to do that. If necessary, if the directory that we want to keep the code in doesn't already exist, we'll need to create it. Then we'll need to create the file using a text editor, edit the code, and then create a screenshot so that you can turn that in with your assignment. Okay, so first thing, I'm going to store the code in the temp directory of my H drive in a subdirectory called code. That's where I want to store the file, and then I'll execute the file from there. So I'm going to pull up a command prompt, and there I am, the default. And so the first thing I need to do is navigate to that directory, H, so just cd temp. And then if I do a dir to see if the code exists, the code subdirectory exists, it doesn't. So I'm going to create that code, md code. Now do a dir, and there's our code directory. So I'll go into the code directory, code. Again, dir should be empty, and it is. So that's the second step. We've decided where to keep it, and we've created the directory structure. So the next step is to create the text file, use the Python text file using a text editor. So I'm going to use the Notepad, sorry about that, Notepad. And so I'm going to open up Notepad here, and I'll just enter the commands enter the commands that are given for the script. So let's do that. Just numbers equals 1, 2, 3, 87, 96, 24, 104, 16, 85, 55, 62, 109, and then that completes the first line. Hit the new line to start the second line. Total equals 0. Count equals 0. Then for num in numbers, then I have a colon. And now the next line after our for loop, we need to be aware of how Python handles indentation. Indentation is an important part of the structure. And so we can either use spaces or tabs, but we have to be consistent across the file. So in this case, I'm just going to use spaces, and so I'll space forward 4 spaces. There's my 4 spaces. And when we get to the for loop and other programmatic constructs, we'll talk more about this requirement for indentation. But for people who are new to Python, this indentation requirement can cause some problems. So again, it doesn't matter whether you use tabs or spaces as long as you are consistent. So count equals count plus 1. Now we compute the average. Average equals float total divided by float count. Then I'm going to print average. So I think we have it here. Numbers, got all the numbers, total, count. For num in numbers, total equals total plus num, count equals count plus 1, average equals float total divided by float count, print average. Okay, so I think we have it, the text file. So now we're going to use the save as command to save it. And one thing about using Notepad, I need to make sure I'm in the correct directory. So I'm not. Right now I'm in htemp. I need to go to code directory. And then by default, Notepad saves everything as text. So we need to use the pull down and say switch this to all files, and we're just going to call this sm.py. So I'm going to name the file sm, and I'm going to give it the Python py extension. So now when I do a dir, there's my file. I can also type sm.py, and it looks to be correct. And so the last step, or the next step in our process, would be to execute the code. So I'm just going to say Python sm.py. And you can see that Python executed the script, computed the mean as 76.1. Because it causes users new to Python so many problems, I want to talk just a little bit more about this indentation idea. So you can see here that we have our indentation that defines the block structure for the for loop. So let's just go back here and say, suppose on the second line, instead of having 4 spaces, we had 5 spaces. So we have changed the number of spaces in that we've indented. So if I save the file and then go execute it, you can see that I'm getting an error that says indentation error. This is an unexpected indent. And so as I mentioned, Python uses indentation to define structure, where other languages sometimes use braces or parentheses to define structure. Python uses the spacing and indentation structure. And so if I did either different numbers of spaces, or in this case I did a tab, so for total the line 1 of the block I have a space, and line 2 I have a tab, and then I run my code, again I'm going to get that same unexpected indentation error. But if I go back to total line and add a tab there, so now both, instead of having spaces, both lines have tabs. Now it executes perfectly. So again, it doesn't matter whether we use spaces or tabs to denote indentation. We just have to be consistent across any given file. Because of this need to have consistency, one suggestion here that I had made previously is to use a more sophisticated text editor. And so one of the ones I mentioned that I use is called Ultra Edit. And you can see I have the sm.py open there. And one of the benefits here is that it shows whether you have tabs or spaces. So you can see the little tab character there. And if I had, oops, too many there. If I had spaces here, you can see that this particular editor shows spaces as the dots and tabs as these little tab characters, and so you can actually see the difference. And so if I execute the code and get the error, this indentation error, I can go back and look and say, oh, I see the problem here. I've got tabs in one line and spaces in the other line. So something that's just going to make your coding a little bit easier. The last thing we would have to do is do the screenshot. So in case you haven't done that before, I'm going to use the snipping tool. So there's my snipping tool. I'd already created one, so let's do a new one. And then I want to do a rectangular snip, and I'm just going to grab this part as follows. And so now I have my nice screenshot, and I can either save that as an image file or use the copy command to paste that into a Word file or a PowerPoint document, or whatever I'd like to do now that I have that image. And so again, to review the steps that we followed, we first of all decided where to keep the code. In our case, that was in the htemp code directory. It didn't exist, so I created it. I then used the Notepad text editor to create the file, executed the code, and took a screenshot. And so note that the next script I do, if I choose to put it in htemp code, I won't have to go through the creation of the directory structure because it will already be there. So I would encourage you to think about a location or the hierarchical structure for where you want to keep your code, and try to organize it so that you keep all of the code in the same place, making subdirectories wherever it's appropriate to keep things organized.